It should also be noted that these aspects of the letters of John bear a critical resemblance to our time in a peculiar way, because of his pointing out that it is the last hour. While he understands the existence of an Antichrist spirit, he can't see it in himself. He can't quite notice that in his act of judging, it is itself of the Antichrist spirit. Those today who conflate this spirit with the images from Revelations are often also filled with the dread of the presence. There is to this weak thinking so much perceived woe in the world, so much that they judge to be wrong or evil, that they think then, how can it not be the last hour? The problem is that this view, especially today, fails to appreciate the lessons of history in which nearly every crisis of Western civilization brought out the assumption that that particular crisis was the last hour, was the end times. What justification is there that makes modern end times believers hold that they are the ones who have finally got it right? The reality is that such a view is all beam and no mote, and sees the world not as it is, but only as something wrong because it is different from what we in our self-righteous vanity assume it should be. The fundamental problem is one that has been true all along. Let's call this problem the absence of Christian practice. Here is Christ from the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7:24-27. Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. The dominance of the need for systems of belief and doctrine, and their supposed importance over Christian practice, is what leads to all manner of errors. Of significance here is an idea that I can't find a source for, but which is as follows. The world cannot be cured of error by rational argument. The world is not just rational. It is also irrational, that is, emotionally impulsive, and transrational, that is, capable of being transcended. Partly the idea here is that when politicians compose what appears to be a rational argument for their view of what government policy should be, they act as if this argument should win in a contest or a debate. A similar kind of events occur in religion, when supposedly rational argument is used to distinguish one set of beliefs from another set of beliefs. People who do this professionally are often called theologists and sometimes philosophers. In the political world they are often called lawyers. Yet the fact is that the idea of Christian practice is about the will. It is not about the intellect. Although one can come to experience that the substance and content of the intellect may be made to rise and transform through acts of the will applied to the mind. Confusion often arises, however, in Christian practice when we hear someone make this kind of reference in an argumentative way against the importance of Christian practice. It is not by works alone, but only by the grace of God that we are saved. First, it is significant for experience to make a distinction between the four Gospels and the rest of the New Testament, including Revelations. If one is to understand what Christ means in the Sermon on the Mount by practice. For all that is valiant and righteous in the letters of Paul and others, the true potential of the soul is to be found foremost through the efforts to practice Christ's teachings directly from the four Gospels. Recognizing that these are not to be theologically interpreted away from their plain meaning by the use of argument based on something else in the rest of the New Testament or even the Old Testament. Paul, for example, interprets Christ's teachings, but he is clearly not Christ himself. To make this as clear as possible, we make a great confusion if we place on the same level of importance any of that which is in the Bible that is not directly the sayings of Christ in the four Gospels. Of those sayings, God speaks clearly if we but put into practice what is said. Only through such practice will we find the right way to interpret the rest of the Bible. If, for example, one were to try to invent a counter-argument of an intellectual nature against the importance of practice of the teachings of the four Gospels, we are then trying to modify what Christ taught by reference to the error-prone interpretations of the disciples. For all else that they do, and this includes the letters of Paul, it is what is remembered and taught about what Christ actually said and did that is the most important. Whatever else is in the New Testament must be measured against Christ's actual words and deeds. Rising up the idea that works alone cannot lead to salvation is to follow a human interpretation of the meaning of the words of God. The teachings of Christ can only be fully understood when practiced. They are not matters of the intellect or lawyer-like theological or philosophical debate. Keep in mind that what is being said here is not argumentative and reasoning toward a different intellectual conclusion, but rather based on what becomes understood of Christ's teachings through a will that practices. What the disciples understood was limited by their human nature, and this human nature can only be transcended through practice. What you have here then is a confusion of different themes and realities that must be distinguished. The intellectual problems are many, for the theological impulse multiplies possible interpretations of doctrine and dogma endlessly, while the way through their confusion is to focus on practice first. The historical Arianism controversy, for example, was an argument about matters which someone who practices would realize has no real practical meaning if we are to follow in his steps. We follow as best as possible Christ's clear teachings, and through the resulting life trials and experiences, our ability to understand and know is enhanced. From this enhanced state, we then gain a better insight into the meaning of Christ's teachings, and as well a better ability to appreciate the limits of what was later added by Paul and others according to their own interpretation.